Cardboard automata is a complex activity, and it requires careful observation, attention to detail, experimentation, and lots of patience to explore. So when designing the activity, we thought very carefully about ways in which we can support the tinkering process through the sometimes challenging activity. We do this by paying attention to the materials and invitations built into the activity, by being thoughtful when we intervene as facilitators during building, and by setting up an environment that supports the specific kinds of investigations that this activity requires.
This activity is designed to let everyone choose what they want to build. This is especially important for cardboard automata because building them is not easy, and we want learners to care about what they're building, especially when it gets tricky. We've pre-built a series of motion examples to help give learners a sense of the possibility of what you can make with a cardboard automata, but also to serve as a guide for when they get stuck building their own. For this activity, we use familiar materials in unfamiliar ways. A cardboard box becomes the base of the automata, skewer sticks become axles and cranks, and foam scraps and cardboard become the cams, cam followers, and characters in the stories. All of these materials can be cut with scissors or a hobby knife. We want people to think carefully about how the movement and mechanism that they design impacts the character and narrative elements. We've found that when people spend equal amounts of time troubleshooting their mechanism and building their characters, they tend to have very rich experiences.
Facilitating cardboard automata presents some specific challenges, and it's a little trickier than most other activities. Because the building process tends to reward a more linear process and paying close attention to which part gets connected to what, it can be a little difficult to backtrack and change things once you started building them. So it's very important to try the activity first from a learner's perspective. Become intimately familiar with all the different types of motion that are provided. This will pay big dividends later on when you're trying to anticipate likely moments of frustration and help learners overcome those. One thing to keep in mind is that small changes like the specific size and shape of cams and followers can make a big difference in the way the automata behaves. But it's really hard to appreciate those until the automata is well underway in the construction. And at that point, it can seem really costly to make changes to the building. So encouraging people to keep focusing on the process rather than on the final product will go a long way towards ensuring that they keep a tinkerer's disposition and don't get too frustrated with the hiccups that are going to happen along the way. There are two parts to an automaton. The bottom part provides the motion and the mechanism, and the top part is the narrative part, the story that you're telling. One approach to building an automata is to have a story in mind and then try to build a mechanism that will make it happen. In my experience, I found that can become very frustrating because trying to reproduce a very specific motion that you have in mind is very difficult. So an alternative approach that you can experiment with is to instead focus on the motion first. For this, we provide 4 or 5 different examples that don't have a narrative part on top, but just the mechanism. And we encourage learners to pick one and just start reproducing it. And often in that process, there will be a character or a story that will naturally emerge or be suggested by the motion that's created. And then a full narrative can be built around that. Ultimately, we consider the activity particularly successful when learners don't just limit themselves to the examples we provide, but they integrate different mechanisms and come up with their own ideas and solutions. When troubleshooting problems, try to take a minimal interference approach. Ask questions first rather than propose solutions right away. A good facilitation technique is to look side by side together with a learner at what they're trying to accomplish. And then asking questions, trying to suss out which parts need to be loose and freely moving and which parts need to be glued together and stable. For that, it's helpful to have an example of the type of mechanism they're working on. And then looking together, you can compare what they're working on and what they're trying to accomplish. Encourage careful observation and attention to details. It can be difficult to test your automata without gluing at least some of the parts together. Like the cams to the skewers, otherwise they spin freely and they don't have enough friction. But it is important as much as possible to test those parts in place before you decide to glue them down. But sometimes it's hard to know which parts can be glued together and which part can be left loose. With experience, you will be able to anticipate those moments, and rather than stopping learners or correcting them preemptively, I encourage you to just let them slow down, pay careful attention, maybe look at an example and notice which parts are connected together and which parts are loose. Of course, sometimes mistakes will happen, but it is always possible to fix a mistake. And oftentimes, from a mistake, new directions that are worth exploring will emerge. So don't get too stressed out.
There are a couple of things that we pay attention to when creating an environment that supports the cardboard automata activity. We'd like to have people sitting around a communal table and working together as they build their automata. People get new ideas and new inspirations when they see what other people are building next to them, and it helps us sometimes with facilitation because they can often help each other when something goes wrong. We place most of the materials that people build with right in the center of the table. This allows for easy access to anybody who's wanting to use the foam or the cardboard or the other parts to build their automata. We take the tools and we move them off to the side and create separate tool stations. We have a station usually for sharp tools, like knives and scissors, and we have a separate station for hot melt glue. Especially for those who haven't used this tool in the past, we can then facilitate people one at a time and show them the safe way to use that hot melt glue in their automata. An important aspect to the environment that supports the cardboard automata is for us to be able to sprinkle examples throughout the space. These might be automata that visitors have built, or that we or our artist friends have constructed that show interesting and inspiring ways of thinking about building. We might have videos or photographs on the walls that show close-up examples of how these mechanisms come together and how they're working. All of these things help to support a new generation of automata and automata builders when they're working on this activity.